funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.
You're listening to Prog.2 of Dare to Care, the three-part series which investigates the stories of various Irish women and men missionaries who selflessly work to help people and communities in faraway lands. In the year 1982, John Skinner, a Puritan missionary, went to work in the diamond mining region of northern Sierra Leone in West Africa. Over the next few years he got deeply involved in justice issues for local people there. Here's John to explain how it all began.
What happened was a group of women came to me after Sunday Mass and said that they were being harassed by soldiers at a checkpoint. So they asked me to accompany them with one of the sisters to visit the police and tell the police about this harassment. I thought they were wasting their time, but seeing that they came to me, I said, okay, we'll go on Monday. This was Sunday when they came to me. Monday we went. And believe it or not, the police did follow up and close the checkpoint. So then I invited the women the following Sunday to come back again and meet me. And then we said, let's look at other issues that are happening in the community. What are the issues? So we fleshed them out a bit, looked at corruption in the hospital, overcharging of medicine, corruption in the schools, paying fees when it's supposed to be free, being harassed by officials, etc. So then I said, let's take just one case every month and let's try and follow it up. So we did that with the hospital, we did that with the schools, and eventually we became known as the Justice and Peace Group that were fighting corruption within the community. We never took on the diamond mining industry because the war broke out before we got to that level and we needed good strength to be able to do it. But it went as far as the Parliament in Sierra Leone. The Parliament issued a warrant for me to be thrown out of the country. They went to the bishops, but the bishops said this is part of the church's work, so they backed me. Then the parliaments, they got a parliamentarian to come up and meet the group in order to try and close it down. He was a lawyer. But in fact, when he saw the work of the group and that, he actually joined the group then. So instead of closing it down, he joined us and supported us. So it was just a question of misunderstanding. And when he saw what we're trying to do, he said, yeah, well, this is what the country needs and that. So
that's great. So he was a patriot to his country, in other words.
Yeah.
And John, just keeping with you talked about hospital. The hospital. I mean, how did you kind of rectify a grievous wrong with the hospital services now in the area that you just touched on there? Please, yeah.
Yeah, well, let's say a woman had a child in the hospital and she'd been terribly overcharged for medicine and for an operation. So we just went to visit the hospital and met the doctors and says, we introduced ourselves as Justice and Peace Group, that we are different people from different parts of the community. And this woman has a serious issue about being overcharged with her child and all that. And we said, we don't think you will pay back, but we want the woman to get treatment for free for the rest of the time, and if there's any other cases we'll follow it up. So the woman did get treatment for the child then for the rest of the time, free treatment, and we went back about another case and doctors and nurses were saying, here's the Justice and Peace Group again, there must be something else up. So we began to build a name for ourselves and going around the schools too and letting the schools know that we were they were like a big brother.
There was a watchdog base.
Watchdog, creating a watchdog system and that to let them know that we knew there was corruption going on. And at the same time, our people in Rome saw what I was trying to do. So then they asked me to come to Rome, set up an office in Rome, and then go around different countries in Africa to work with our own people to try and set up the same system of empowering people, groups, to challenge corruption that's going on.
And as a result, during the 9-year period 1991 to 2000, John Skinner worked to promote justice and peace in many places in Africa.
I spent a lot of time going around Africa, Congo, Zambia, Nigeria, Ghana, Algeria and that. So, I was, even in the Congo, I was kidnapped and brought out to be executed one time, and lucky enough, the person I was with you spoke the local language, so he told them, don't shoot us until you get clearance from your headquarters. So we got clearance from headquarters that we were missionaries and we were not to be touched. So that was, in different situations going around, because part of my work was to go into conflict situations and assess what should the church be doing in these situations and that, yeah.
And after 9 years of such work, in the year 2000, John Skinner went to work in Ethiopia for 10 years. Following that, in the year 2012, he began working in one of the poorest countries in the world, South Sudan, where he still works. So what exactly does his current work there entail?
The work entails, really at the moment, it's very basic. Building schools. We're just finished building a school. Unfortunately, because we have to bring everything in from the outside, there's no roads in South Sudan, there's no electricity in any part of the country, even in the capital city, there's no running water in any part of the country. So we depend on solar for our energy. So we're building schools at the moment, and there's one primary school which we took over. There's 700 pupils in the primary school. There's still no classrooms. They're out under the trees. And I was very surprised to find that they had no toilets. And I asked them, why there's no toilets? They said, well, the children go to school in the morning without breakfast. They don't get lunch in the school, so why do they need toilets? So one of the first things we had to do was to get money and build toilets and that for our school children. And then we've just finished we're nearly completing and building a new school at €370,000, primary school, classrooms.
And how many pupils will it facilitate?
About 1,000, yes. Yeah.
Wow, so education, there's a huge demand for education in this country.
Huge demand for education and all of that, yeah.
And how about feeding the children? I mean, the children, you just touched on there that, the kids get no breakfast, no dinner.
Yeah, but now there's a very good organisation called Mary's Meals. Yeah, I don't know if people have come across it. It was started by a Scottish man based on his going to Medjugorje, and he decided that he would try and give a school meal to children in the underdeveloped countries. So we are into that program now, and we are feeding all our school children at the moment. So we have about 2,000 or 3,000 school meals every day, and just coordinating that, coordinating teaching and all of that, and getting infrastructure set up is really what we're doing.
And veering away from the work of Irish missionaries in Africa and turning our attention to Asia, Father Donny Hogan, a Columban missionary, spent much of his life working as a missionary priest in the Philippines. For some of his time there, from 1993 to 1999, he was regional director in charge of all Columban missionaries in the Philippines. It was during this period in the year 1997 that Donny's Columban colleague, Father Des Hartford, who was engaged in peace and reconciliation work between Muslims and Christians in the southern war-ravaged Filipino island of Mindinao, was kidnapped by anti-government rebels. Donny Hogan.
Des Hartford from Lusk in County Dublin. Des, who was a year ahead of me here in the seminary, all of a sudden he was kidnapped. He was working on the island of Mindinao in an area which is predominantly Muslim, and his apostolate, together with a very small group of Columbans, nobody was assigned there, they had to volunteer for it. It was special, because now they weren't going to be working with Christians mostly. There were some Christians there, but their primary work would have been dialogue of life with the Muslims, trying to break down barriers. Des even lived with a Muslim family, as did his companion Rufus Halley, who I mentioned later. But they really soaked in the culture. They built up trust with the people. And then all of a sudden, Des was betrayed. Someone whose daughter he was helping through college set him up, and he was kidnapped and taken away. And all of a sudden, we heard in Manila, we heard it initially from his friend, the Archbishop Capella, who I had known personally as well. So he called up saying, this is what happened. Des was kidnapped. They had demands of the government, and they were using Des as a pawn to get these demands. They claimed that the government had promised them so many things and had not delivered. So immediately, what do? Our main fear, of course, we had to notify the family through our bosses here in worldwide in Ireland. Vicar General happened to be the one in charge at the time, and he was an Australian. So there was constant telephone, fax, contact with him so that he could keep up the dialogue with the family. Our purpose there was reassuring the family, even though I must admit we had our own fears that something drastic could have happened, but trying to reassure the family. Then the next thing was contacting the nuncio so that the Vatican would know and support the bishops, contacting their men in charge, contacting the president. That was our primary thing at that time, to try and ensure that the safety of Des would be the number one priority. In other words, what we were afraid of was the army would go in like Rambo and shoot all around in order to rescue him, and he would get killed in the crossfire. We managed, through a friend, to get a letter to President Ramos. It was Ramos at the time. Got a message to him. Got a message then to the ambassador, Joe Hayes, a wonderful person, based in Beijing, but covering the Philippines. And he had been to the Philippines, so I had met him before as well. He immediately faxed President Ramos. We had our letter hand-delivered to President Ramos, and we heard from this friend of ours, who was some government official, that it was actually discussed at the time. Ramos comes out, the president, the next day, and he makes a declaration to the press. He says, the safety of, he was a Monsignor Des Hartford, is paramount. And that's where we will try and negotiate, but his safety is paramount. So from there on, there was trying to get dialogue, what's happening. And then all of a sudden, about 2 days later, a general telephones me, and Nazareno. He says, Father Hogan, he says, we have word that Father Hartford is going to be released tomorrow morning. So basically, I went to Mindinao then early the next morning, a couple of hours plane ride, and to be there for the handing over of Des. I made an awful mistake. I telephoned the family because up to this, everything was bad news. There was talk about another group trying to take him over from the group that had kidnapped him, a more dangerous group. But I made a mistake. Because the family had only been hearing the bad news and everything was down, all of a sudden our hope lifted, and I felt, well, I need to share this with the family, help them, So I telephoned directly the family, didn't go through our man in Ireland, just wanted them to hear the good news. Went down to Mindinao, waiting all day, up to the night time. Eventually, word came through. Negotiations have broken down. I headed back to Manila. I hadn't the heart to call the family, so I called our Vicar General in Ireland, Noel Connolly, asked him, would he contact the family, tell them it was a false alarm. But I was so down after it, and after your expectations. So then further negotiations, and a letter came out from Des at one stage saying he's all right, but they are making demands of the government, whatever. Eventually, General Nazareno, after another maybe 5 days more, he telephones me, something is going to happen. Again, I head down to Mindinao. At this stage now, it's about 10 days since he was kidnapped. And things were really getting scary. We just didn't know what was going to happen. They weren't making any demands of the Columbans for money or anything like that. It was demands of the government with regard to issues they had. So at that stage, I headed to Mindinao. Again, I didn't tell the family this time that there was a hope, because I didn't believe, Waiting around again all day in another parish. Eventually, walking up and down the church, wondering what's going to happen. 10 o'clock at night, we decide nothing is going to happen. So I went back to the nearest Columban parish, went to bed. And this is now the 11th day. At about 11:15, 12 or after, I got this call from Ireland, from Noel Connolly, our man. He said, Des is released. I could not believe it. I said, Noel, we've been waiting here all day. General Nazarino has told us he's going to be released, but he has not been released. Noel says, Des is released. I said, how can that be? Then he said, he called his family. He was in the mountain, obviously access to the military base, and was given permission, this is now after midnight, to call his family. And he called, just one call, and he called them. And I still couldn't believe it. Anyway, I went back to bed. 15 minutes later, General Nazarino rings. Father Hartford has been released. We have him here in the camp. We will be down in the parish where you are at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning for the handing over. I didn't know, whether to accept that, but it was confirmation, So next morning, all these military things, trucks come into the compound. We looking down at them. Rufus Halley was with me, a friend of Des. The Archbishop was there, waiting. And Des comes up, emaciated and haggard. We had a slap-up breakfast. I don't know where we got the sausages, but we had a big breakfast ready for him. Then, anyway, after that, he began to unwind. Then, our headquarters at that stage was Cagayan de Oro, which is about an hour away. So they were taking Des in the military ambulance. So I sat in with them in the military ambulance. We went to Cagayan de Oro, where there was the formal handing over, and where all the press had been contacted, and Des was interviewed and spoke about how he had been betrayed. And what a relief.
And while Donny Hogan was also hugely relieved to have got his colleague Des Hartford back alive in 1997. Unfortunately, their Columban colleague Father Rufus Halley, who was also engaged in peace and reconciliation work between Muslims and Christians in the Filipino island of Mindinao, was viciously murdered a few years later. Donny Hogan.
Then 2001, 4 years later, an attempt was made on Rufus's life. Well, to abduct Rufus. And in the course of this, he was shot in cold blood. He resisted. Next minute, bang, bang, shot dead. It is traumatic still.
And veering away from the work of Irish missionaries in Asia and turning our attention once again to Africa, Mary O'Shea, a Holy Rosary missionary sister, spent 38 years working in Cameroon from the late 1970s to the year 2017. Most of that time she was situated in a place called Ndu, and her work entailed promoting justice and peace, care for the environment, community health and much more. Now, concerning her work in health, Mary O'Shea had this story to share.
We had the Health Commission, and when I started going out into the families, I discovered that there were many children who had physical and mental disabilities, and really there was no help for them. Either they didn't go to school or they didn't get any help physically because they couldn't afford to send them to hospital. So then, in a lot of cases, it is the women who do the farms. So if a woman had a child with special needs, then she couldn't go to the farm or she couldn't go to the market. And it was mainly the women did the farms. So I just found that very difficult, to go out and see people that had no help at all. And I discovered in the end that there was a group in Holland called Lilian Fund. And Lilian Fund, their basic thing was to help young people with disabilities. And they were actually founded by a lady who had a disability. So they were helping young people with disabilities all over the world. Then I wrote to them, and they asked me would I become a mediator between them and the children. Now, this involved for myself, if a child came to me, I would interview the child and the mother, usually, and I would have to go out to the home to see how things were there, then send the child to hospital for diagnosis. Then when the child was diagnosed, I would have to write up a project for each individual child on what was the problem, what was the diagnosis, the cost of it, what might be needed in the line of surgery maybe, or physiotherapy. And then also this group would provide primary and secondary education. And this was absolutely wonderful. So in my time then, I was working, you see, with the parents and with the Health Commission. So about 105 children were assisted in this way. And I was amazed at the kind of results. Now, some of those children became the breadwinners in the homes after, because...
Are you for real?
These
were children who beforehand had been designated special needs, out of the way, forgotten about, and all of a sudden they're becoming a breadwinner. Wow.
Yeah. You see, there was a very, very good place that we sent them. The Franciscan sisters had a rehabilitation centre, and they were just absolutely wonderful. They helped those children in any way that they could. And as I say, they did very well after. Now, there was one of them called Tabitha. Now, Tabitha had been helped, but she was still in a wheelchair. I think she was the most wonderful woman I ever met. She was on a wheelchair, but she was going out visiting all the people with disabilities. Now, I suppose in an area the size of Cork and Kerry, she got onto a motorcycle because the roads would be too bad to go in a car, and she would visit all these people, and I was amazed at her. But we had a meeting before I came home, and we had a meeting of the parents and some of the local women from the villages. And in the end, she said, if you need help, you need to belong to a group. You'll get no financial help unless you belong to a group. And she was right, because they were able to help each other. And it was a wonderful experience. Now she has taken over from me as the mediator. And she's working away financially and everything else with it. And it's going very well.
And aside from her work to help improve the quality of life for people with special needs and their families, Mary O'Shea also worked to promote justice for many women in her community.
In our Justice and Peace Commission, we gave seminars on a variety of topics, and one of the main ones was on marriage. And we talked about traditional marriage, we talked about church marriage, and we talked about legal marriages. Now, most married couples would have a traditional marriage, which they do in the village. Then some would have a church marriage. Obviously, they'd have that in the church. Now, one thing that we weren't clear about up to this was the legal marriage. Now, there were many, many women that I met in Indu. When their husbands died, they weren't able to inherit their own home. So you had a woman with her children, and her brothers-in-law inherited her home. So that was a very difficult situation for the women. Now, when we were doing our Justice and Peace, we discovered that if they had a legal marriage, that they would have the right to inheritance. So we went off and we talked a lot about it. Now, some people thought it was too expensive, and then we had to get over that hurdle. So we gathered couples together to discuss it, and we went to the local council. They used to do the legal marriages, and we said, if we gathered big groups of people, of couples together, would you do it cheaper? So they agreed to do it much cheaper. So even before I came home, there were a group of 27 couples married the same day as a group. And it was a wonderful occasion. The women were delighted. The men were slow sometimes about it.
Why am I not surprised? It's for the woman's behoof, if the man should be taken. Obviously, the in-laws wouldn't be happy.
The in-laws wouldn't be happy at all. Or even the real husband, you see. And I would sit down and I'd say, now you were married for 20 years. You have 4 or 5 children. Your wife has worked with you. I said, and when you die, because you'll probably die before she dies because you're much older usually, then do you want her to be out on the street? And I think I convinced quite a few of them that they should go ahead and have the legal marriages. And we had great success with that.
Was it hard? Was it hard trying to convince some of the men?
It was very hard to try to convince some of the men because they might be thinking, well, maybe later on I might meet another younger woman and I'd marry her.
Ulterior motive.
Yes, but generally I managed.
And to hear more stories of Irish missionaries in faraway lands, then make sure to catch our next number 3 programme in this 3-part Dare to Care series. Until then, I'm going to leave the last word with various contributors.
For me, the best thing about being a missionary was being allowed into people's lives, to share with them, especially in times of suffering, or as it was in the area in the Philippines, in time of persecution.
You were enriched by the faith of the people.
The people taught me so much, and I knew I had to depend on God. I suppose my faith was strengthened when I saw the faith they had.
The Lord is on our side. I honestly think we were called somewhere to do this, and that's how it is.
Funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.